In mid-October 1777, a defeated British commander stepped onto a soaked New York battlefield to surrender his blade to an American rebel. Trailing behind him were roughly 6,000 elite troops, once a premier global fighting force, who were now merely captives. They had originally descended from the Canadian border, intending to extinguish an uprising, but the insurgents completely decimated them instead. Within just a few months, this shocking victory pushed France into an official American alliance, permanently altering the global conflict. Yet, if you inquired about the colonial revolt back in early 1777, British citizens would confidently declare it was essentially finished. The previous fall had seen the Patriots driven from New York, leaving Washington's battered forces shivering in New Jersey's icy terrain. His exhausted ranks were rapidly deteriorating as miserable soldiers abandoned their posts and their required service periods came to an end. Meanwhile, politicians were desperately churning out useless paper currency while pleading for vital colonial resources that simply never materialized. Conversely, Great Britain boasted the planet's ultimate armed forces, backed by vast imperial wealth and absolute naval supremacy along the coast. Politicians overseas viewed the uprising as a mere childish outburst that would quickly fade once faced with a professional European military. Back in the capital, leaders weren't anxious, they were simply annoyed, believing the insurrection should have been suppressed long ago. Those confident officials were completely oblivious to the catastrophic failures that awaited their forces across the ocean. During the winter months connecting 1776 and 1777, top officials gathered in elegant Whitehall rooms to draft a definitive strategy. Their tactical vision was remarkably straightforward. Send a massive expeditionary force plunging southward from Canada into the untamed New York frontier. These forces were supposed to march right down the traditional invasion path of Lake Champlain and the Hudson River, aiming to secure Albany, which served as the crucial gateway to dominate the entire Hudson Valley region. Simultaneously, General William Howe was instructed to march the primary British garrison out of New York City and push northward. A third, more compact detachment, led by Colonel Barry St-Leger, was ordered to sweep eastward from Lake Ontario through the Mohawk Valley. Once these three military columns united, they would lock down the Hudson Corridor and effectively slice the American territories right down the middle. This coordinated maneuver was designed to completely sever New England, the fiery epicenter of the uprising, from the remaining southern and middle colonies. Deprived of vital supplies, troop reinforcements, and strategic communication, the colonial insurgency would simply wither away and die. In theory, this grand strategic coordination looked absolutely flawless, but out in the wilderness, it was laying the groundwork for an epic catastrophe. The commander who campaigned most aggressively to lead this ambitious endeavor and ultimately secured the position was Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. At 54 years old, he was a seasoned veteran of the 7 Years' War, a sitting parliamentarian, and even an amateur playwright. Highly charismatic and well-spoken, he possessed a burning social ambition coupled with an unwavering certainty in his own strategic brilliance. His troops affectionately dubbed him Gentleman Johnny, a moniker earned because he stubbornly maintained a lavish lifestyle even in the unforgiving backcountry. He famously ventured into the rugged frontier, hauling a private wine collection, a folding writing desk, and an extensive, immaculate wardrobe. Adding to the spectacle, he was accompanied on the march by his mistress, who happened to be married to a military supply officer. Burgoyne possessed a steadfast conviction that this decisive thrust would single-handedly crush the American resistance and win the entire conflict. Absolutely certain that the campaign would crown him a legendary national savior, he took the initiative to pitch his vision directly to the king. The ambitious strategy also secured an enthusiastic green light from Lord George Germain, the official overseeing the American colonies. Leaving for Canada in the spring of 1777, the general possessed the smug assurance of someone whose victory speech was already drafted. Unfortunately for him, that blinding arrogance would ultimately become the most disastrous misjudgment of the entire conflict. By June, he had successfully mobilized his imposing invasion force at St. John's, situated along Quebec's Richelieu River. It was a truly fearsome military gathering, boasting an impressive fighting strength of nearly 8,000 total personnel. At the core of this host stood roughly 4,000 British regulars, seasoned redcoats drilled in formal European battle formation. They were reinforced by over 3,000 German soldiers, hailing from the regions of Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau. These professional mercenaries had been leased out to the British monarch by their own leaders for a handsome payout. While undeniably rugged and combat-tested, these men were deeply resentful about crossing an ocean to bleed in a foreign dispute. The remainder of the expeditionary force consisted of a diverse mixture of loyalist volunteers and French-Canadian militiamen. Accompanying them were several hundred Native American warriors, recruited primarily from the frontier-dwelling Iroquois, Huron, and Algonquin communities. In a choice that would quickly become a nightmare, the commander also insisted on hauling a monstrous arsenal of over 130 cannon. Stretching out behind the marchers was an agonizingly long supply train bursting with tents, food, and heavy engineering tools. Woven throughout the vital ammunition carts were all of the general's opulent personal indulgences, slowing the entire procession down. With all its pomp and excess, this sprawling column was clearly designed for a ceremonial triumph rather than brutal wilderness warfare. Initially, this grand campaign seemed destined for effortless success, kicking off with the swift capture of Fort Ticonderoga on July 6th. Under the command of Major General Arthur St. Clair, the American defenders practically handed over the stronghold without putting up a fight. They had slipped away under the cover of darkness after British troops managed to drag heavy guns to the peak of Mount Defiance. From that commanding height, the Royal Artillery possessed an unobstructed, deadly view straight down into the rebel fortifications. A wave of terror swept through the garrison as they scrambled southward, abandoning vital cannons and mountains of military stores. Their retreat was so utterly frantic that the fleeing soldiers even left their evening meals sitting untouched on the dining table. Across the Atlantic, news of this sweeping victory sent a sudden jolt of pure jubilation through the halls of London. An ecstatic King George supposedly barged into Queen Charlotte's room, triumphantly declaring that he had completely crushed the rebellious Americans. Conversely, the abrupt loss of the beloved fortress sent terrifying tremors throughout the Continental Congress back in the colonies. Ticonderoga had long been viewed as an invincible barrier, a natural bottleneck perfectly positioned to block any northern incursion. With such a mighty stronghold crumbling so swiftly, terrified patriots wondered how anyone could possibly halt this approaching British juggernaut. While rebel spirits plummeted into deep despair, the British commander's ego inflated to dangerous, unprecedented levels. Blinded by arrogance, he dismissed the simpler, less exhausting water route down Lake George, opting for a much harsher path. He forced his heavily burdened troops to trek overland through 23 miles of dense, untamed wilderness toward the upper Hudson River. Driven by the desire to project an image of an unstoppable land march, he foolishly followed the guidance of a local loyalist. Ultimately, committing to this rugged overland route proved to be a profoundly disastrous blunder for the British. The American commander, General Philip Schuyler, fully realized his disheartened troops couldn't survive a direct open-field battle. Instead of fighting head-on, he unleashed the absolute most ruthless, scorched-earth strategy seen during the entire war. Rebel work crews deliberately chopped down massive trees to blockade trails and completely shattered every bridge along the intended path. They intentionally dammed up flowing creeks to drown valleys, transforming once firm dirt tracks into impassable, muddy bogs. To further choke the enemy's progress, heavy boulders were forcefully rolled into tight, wooded choke points. Every single field of crops was set ablaze, while local livestock was either slaughtered or herded far away. The landscape was stripped completely bare, guaranteeing the approaching redcoats would discover absolutely no food to scavenge. A straightforward trek that should have required a mere few days morphed into a torturous 3-week nightmare. British soldiers found themselves desperately chopping through thick, tangled brush while sweltering under the intense summer sun. They were forced to painfully construct 40 separate bridges alongside a massive wooden pathway spanning 2 miles of deep marshland. All the while, they struggled to haul 130 heavy cannons through muck that swallowed their wheels entirely. With every agonizing step forward, their vital lifeline of provisions, stretching all the way back to Canada, grew perilously thin. As the exhausted invaders pushed deeper south, local rebel militias began to spontaneously emerge from the surrounding wilderness. These phantom fighters picked off scouts and raided supply carts, melting instantly back into the familiar woods they called home. The British commander was wandering blindly into a tightening snare, either completely oblivious to the danger or stubbornly ignoring it. Then, in the final days of July, a gruesome event unfolded that drastically worsened his predicament in unimaginable ways. Jane McCree, a young woman loyal to the crown, was eagerly awaiting a reunion with her betrothed within the royal ranks. Tragically, she was brutally slain and scalped by the very Native American warriors fighting alongside the British forces. The shocking slaughter of a colonist by the Crown's own partners quickly ignited a firestorm of propaganda throughout the region. Fired up by the horrific news, unprecedented waves of fresh recruits flooded into the ranks of the revolutionary militias. Civilians who had previously hesitated to take up arms against the king suddenly seized their weapons and hurried toward the northern front. The tactic of employing indigenous war parties to frighten the borderlands into surrender had spectacularly backfired. Instead of breaking the colonists' will, this alliance drove thousands of enraged, heavily armed volunteers directly to the revolutionary cause. As the calendar turned to August, the invading forces faced severe deprivation, with their critical food stocks rapidly depleting. Their essential beasts of burden were perishing in droves, and the isolated army lacked any means to replace the dying livestock. Driven to desperation by the mounting shortages, the general authorized a highly consequential expedition into the region of modern-day Vermont. He dispatched roughly 700 men, primarily Hessian dragoons and loyalists, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, toward the settlement of Bennington. Their strict orders were to confiscate local cattle, horses, transport carts, and absolutely any vital provisions they could lay their hands on. Royal informants had promised the territory was lightly defended and filled with sympathetic locals, but this assessment was dangerously flawed. Instead of welcoming loyalists, Baum's detachment walked right into Brigadier General John Stark and 2,000 enraged local militiamen. Stark was a seasoned veteran of the French and Indian War, thoroughly heartened by his time serving with Rogers' Rangers. Though he had previously resigned over a rank dispute, the looming British threat brought this fierce frontier fighter right back into the fray. On the morning of August 16th, Stark gestured toward the enemy forces entrenched on a nearby hill and addressed his troops. "Those are the redcoats, and we will defeat them before sunset, or Molly Stark sleeps a widow tonight," he declared. Following his bold promise, the American forces launched a highly coordinated assault, striking the enemy positions from several directions at once. The ensuing combat was incredibly savage, devolving into bloody hand-to-hand clashes that left Lieutenant Colonel Baum mortally wounded. Later that afternoon, a backup column of 700 German troops, led by Heinrich von Breymann, marched into the chaos. Unfortunately for the reinforcements, Stark's men were simultaneously joined by Colonel Seth Warner and his fierce Green Mountain Boys. The newly arrived American fighters wasted no time, thoroughly crushing the German relief column just as they had the first. By the time daylight faded, Burgoyne had suffered devastating casualties, with nearly 1,000 men killed, injured, or taken prisoner. In the span of a single afternoon, a massive eighth of the entire British invasion force had simply ceased to exist. And they had secured absolutely nothing for their trouble, failing to capture even a solitary horse, cow, or supply cart. These catastrophic losses represented the first fatal fractures spreading through the fragile foundation of the Royal Army's grand campaign. Compounding the catastrophe, the invasion's third column, under Barry St. Leger, completely failed its mission to sweep through the Mohawk Valley. The western prong of the invasion had been completely halted by heavy resistance outside the walls of Fort Stanwix. To break the stalemate, Benedict Arnold hurriedly led a Patriot relief column, marching toward the besieged garrison. Arnold employed a brilliant ruse, using a captured loyalist to spread wild, exaggerated rumors through the British camps. Tricked into believing an overwhelming American army was bearing down on them, St. Leger's Native American allies scattered. With his coalition in ruins, the British colonel was forced to completely abandon the siege and retreat to Canada. This disastrous turn of events left Burgoyne as the sole royal commander still advancing through the treacherous wilderness. Soon after, intelligence arrived that would have convinced any logical general to immediately march his troops backward. General William Howe, whose northern advance was the absolute linchpin of the entire grand strategy, simply wasn't coming. Instead, operating under vague approvals from London, Howe had packed his massive army onto a southern-bound fleet. He intended to conquer Philadelphia, incorrectly assuming that taking the American capital would permanently crush the rebellion. This monumental strategic blunder left Burgoyne's forces entirely isolated, without any hope of support from the south. No reinforcements would be marching up the river to save his starving, rapidly shrinking army at Albany. Any cautious military leader would have immediately fallen back to Ticonderoga to await clearer, safer directives. But Burgoyne was far from cautious, and his overwhelming pride pushed him to ignore the glaring, fatal danger. He drove his remaining men boldly across the Hudson River, decisively severing his sole avenue of retreat. Historians still argue whether this crossing was driven by sheer courage, unchecked ego, or pure denial of his failing strategy. Regardless of his underlying motives for trapping himself, the historical consequences of this fateful choice would prove absolutely undeniable. By the middle of September, his men traversed a temporary bridge of boats near Saratoga, known today as Schuylerville, New York. Directly south of this position, firmly blocking the vital road to Albany, waited the entirety of the American Northern Army. The Patriot troops had heavily entrenched themselves upon a dominant, elevated position that came to be known as Bemis Heights. These formidable earthworks were crafted by Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko, an allied Polish engineer who perfectly understood how to exploit the landscape. His clever design utilized steep bluffs that overlooked the water, while anchoring the opposite side against thick, impassable forest. Meanwhile, the sheer size of the rebel military had grown exponentially since those grim early days following the loss of Ticonderoga. With General Horatio Gates stepping in to replace Schuyler, waves of fresh militiamen were now pouring down from New England. Everyday laborers, from blacksmiths to merchants with no formal military experience, were constantly arriving in camp armed with their personal muskets. Encouraged by the recent triumph at Bennington, these volunteers carried a newfound faith that the royal forces could truly be halted. Thanks to this massive surge of enthusiastic recruits, General Gates now boasted an impressive army of 12,000 to 15,000 troops. Conversely, the British commander's own effective fighting force had rapidly dwindled down to a meagre 6,000 combat-ready soldiers. Even though he found himself vastly outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, he stubbornly prepared to launch an assault anyway. On September 19, 1777, the first major battle ignited at Freeman's Farm as 3 British columns pushed into the woods. Seeking a vulnerability in the rebel defences, the royal forces desperately hoped to outmaneuver their entrenched enemy. Instead of finding an easy opening, the advancing British troops slammed directly into the fiercely determined Benedict Arnold. At this stage of the conflict, Arnold stood out as the most brilliantly aggressive tactician in the entire American command. Yet his colossal ego and constant obsession with status made him an utterly infuriating officer to work alongside. He was currently embroiled in a deeply toxic rivalry with his superior, General Gates, fighting bitterly over glory and authority. However, all of that petty infighting faded into total insignificance the moment the violent afternoon clash began to unfold. Pushing back against caution, Arnold persuaded Gates to deploy Daniel Morgan's elite sharpshooters and Henry Dearborn's agile infantry forward. Rather than passively waiting behind their fortified earthworks, these specialized units pushed straight into the forest to confront the attackers head-on. The ensuing confrontation in that remote farm clearing rapidly devolved into one of the most ruthless engagements of the entire war. For 4 grueling hours, the opposing forces pounded each other without a shred of mercy across the contested ground. Wielding customized firearms capable of striking targets at unbelievable ranges, the frontiersmen from Virginia and Pennsylvania proved absolutely lethal. With terrifying and methodical precision, these hidden riflemen systematically hunted down high-ranking British officers and essential artillery crews. In desperate response, the King's soldiers mounted fierce bayonet charges, temporarily shoving the rebels back toward the safety of the trees. But fresh Patriot reserves would immediately swarm back into the fray, instantly erasing whatever precious ground the Royal Infantry had just captured. By nightfall, the invaders technically claimed the field, but losing 600 men made it a crippling triumph that sparked 18 days of agony. General Burgoyne entrenched his forces at Freeman's Farm, banking on reinforcements from General Clinton, who had already abandoned his sluggish Hudson advance. The commander held out for provisions that were simply a fantasy, watching helplessly as his grim predicament deteriorated with each passing sunrise. Meanwhile, the Patriot ranks swelled exponentially as endless waves of incoming militia stretched General Gates's blockade completely around the Royal Army. Under the cloak of darkness, colonial strike teams constantly infiltrated the camp to silence guards, snatch mounts, and incinerate food stockpiles. Royal soldiers soon found themselves surviving on less than half their normal meals, while famished horses resorted to gnawing bark off trees. As starvation set in, mass desertions plagued the camp, with local loyalists and Canadian volunteers fleeing the disastrous expedition at alarming rates. Assessing the bleak reality of the standoff, the remaining Native American allies smartly and silently vanished back into the untamed wilderness. Although the hired German regiments maintained strict order despite their complaints, the fighting spirit of the British infantry completely dissolved into the autumn mud. Surrounded by this decaying army, the oblivious commander continued sipping fine champagne with his dinners, entirely lacking any viable strategy to escape. With time running out, on the 7th of October, the desperate British leader finally decided to play his very last tactical card. He pushed 1,500 scouts forward to aggressively test the colonial left wing, praying he could punch a miraculous escape route toward Albany. This fateful gamble sparked the Battle of Bemis Heights, serving as the ultimate graveyard for his once grand northern campaign. However, the vigilant rebel sentries caught sight of this probing maneuver almost instantly, completely ruining any hope for a surprise attack. Without hesitation, General Gates unleashed an absolutely overwhelming counteroffensive, throwing the full weight of his army at the vulnerable detachment. Initiating the crushing blow, Daniel Morgan's legendary sharpshooters violently slammed into the exposed right edge of the Royal formation. Simultaneously, Enoch Poor's New Hampshire troops violently crashed into the opposing left side of the enemy lines. Caught in a relentless, devastating crossfire from all angles, the core of the British formation began to buckle and collapse. Suddenly, slicing right through the battlefield's absolute pandemonium, Benedict Arnold came charging forward atop a stout brown stallion. He had actually been officially stripped of his authority following a vicious screaming match with General Gates. His commanding officer preferred a strictly cautious defense, deeply despising Arnold's fiery combat style and relentless hunger for recognition. For nearly 3 weeks, the disgraced officer had seethed in his quarters, storming around his tent and heavily hitting the bottle. Now, completely ignoring his suspension and fueled by apparent intoxication, he charged into the fray with suicidal abandon. Darting wildly across the blazing front lines, he personally galvanized the Patriot ranks and spearheaded their fierce counterattacks. He became a chaotic, roaring epicenter of energy, single-handedly dragging the entire colonial offensive forward through sheer willpower. As evening approached, he orchestrated a frantic frontal charge on the Bremen redoubt, a heavily entrenched German stronghold anchoring the enemy's flank. Galvanized by his undeniable presence, the rebel soldiers fiercely flooded over the towering earthen barricades. In the thick of the breach, fatal gunfire dropped Arnold's steed, which collapsed heavily and pulverized his left leg. Howling in sheer agony and fury, he suffered a catastrophic break to the exact same bone shattered years earlier at Quebec. Had that fateful bullet struck merely a couple of feet higher, he would have been immortalized forever as a legendary founding patriot. However, his survival that day guaranteed that his ultimate legacy was destined to travel down a far darker, unexpected path. With the crucial redoubt overrun, Burgoyne's entire defensive line began to completely unravel, causing his right flank to utterly disintegrate. As nightfall and heavy rain descended, the Royal soldiers scattered back to their encampments in utter chaos, leaving behind 600 casualties. The staggering death toll included Brigadier General Simon Fraser, a highly respected and exceptionally skilled leader within the royal ranks. He had galloped his grey stallion relentlessly across the failing defensive lines, using pure bravery to inspire his men and maintain order. Recognizing this threat, Daniel Morgan supposedly instructed a top sharpshooter, likely Timothy Murphy, to eliminate the inspiring commander. A single crack echoed from nearly 300 yards away, and the general collapsed onto his mount with a fatal wound. With Fraser's demise, the final shred of redcoat discipline vanished entirely, forcing Burgoyne to mandate a gloomy, northbound withdrawal towards Saratoga. Stumbling through the pitch-black night, the battered military trudged through thoroughfares that torrential downpours had transformed into impassable rivers of sludge. The grim conditions forced the retreating commanders to make a heartbreaking choice, abandoning their agonizingly injured soldiers right where they had fallen. Rebel pursuers hounded them from every conceivable direction, while forward-moving militia divisions completely severed their anticipated northern escape routes. Just 4 agonizing days later, the trap violently snapped shut, leaving the British commander entirely boxed in by enemy forces. His surviving men clustered desperately within a rapidly tightening circle atop the bluffs overlooking the Hudson, beside the wreckage of Schuyler's Manor. From the opposite banks of the river, Patriot cannons unleashed a relentless, unanswered bombardment directly into the vulnerable, trapped encampment. Deadly rebel snipers, concealed in the surrounding wilderness, made simply standing upright a fatal mistake for anyone inside the shrinking perimeter. Cut off from all rations, depleted of ammunition, and lacking any path to safety, the trapped officers realized their inevitable doom was approaching. Accepting the grim reality of his situation, the defeated British general finally initiated talks of capitulation. On October 17, 1777, John Burgoyne officially handed his vanquished army over to the American commander, Major General Horatio Gates. The conditions of the surrender were surprisingly lenient for a force that had been so thoroughly crushed. British officers were granted permission to hold on to their ceremonial swords as well as their private belongings. The enlisted men paraded out with full military dignity, their regimental flags soaring high to the rhythmic beat of drums. Reaching an open meadow, the defeated ranks solemnly stacked their rifles, officially transitioning into prisoners of war. On that fateful afternoon, a staggering total of 5,791 soldiers surrendered their weaponry. It stood as the most massive capitulation of Crown forces on a foreign battlefield that anyone alive could recall. The fallen commander had previously vowed he would only leave America triumphant. Yet now he stood humbled before his rival. "The fortunes of war have made me your prisoner," he graciously remarked as he yielded to Gates. It was a dignified sentiment from a man forced to watch his legacy and army vanish into the autumn mire. But the aftermath of this monumental victory radiated outward like a seismic blast, fundamentally transforming the global conflict. Across the ocean in Paris, Benjamin Franklin had spent months desperately trying to persuade King Louis XVI to publicly champion the Patriot Rebellion. While France had covertly smuggled munitions and funds through shadow networks, they steadfastly refused to openly support a string of American defeats. This staggering triumph instantly changed their minds, proving the rebellion was viable and giving France a golden opportunity to humiliate their ancient rival. Seizing this moment, the French crown formally allied with the United States in early 1778, signing pacts of both trade and military cooperation. Suddenly, vital European funds poured into Patriot coffers, while mighty French warships began contesting Britain's absolute control over the Atlantic and Caribbean seas. Experienced military minds, Notably, the Marquis de Lafayette travelled across the ocean to directly advise George Washington and strengthen his command staff. This crucial partnership would eventually see French troops standing shoulder to shoulder with American Continentals during the climactic siege of Yorktown 3 years later. Soon, Spain and the Netherlands plunged into the fray, expanding a localized colonial dispute into a sprawling global conflict that exhausted British resources. Yet, none of these monumental international shifts would have materialized without that singular, earth-shattering triumph on the battlefields of New York. As for the defeated General Burgoyne, he sailed back to Britain on parole in 1778, destined to spend his remaining years justifying his catastrophic failure. He pointed fingers at everyone, criticizing Germain for the chaotic directives and bitterly condemning Howe for abandoning the northern strategy entirely. He also cursed the unforgiving American wilderness, the brutal weather conditions, and the logistical nightmare of fighting an ocean away from home. Despite defending himself vigorously during parliamentary hearings, the disgraced commander was stripped of his military credibility and never led troops into battle again. Retreating to his former passion for the stage, he penned a moderately well-received comedy before quietly passing away a decade and a half later. Tragically for him, history would not remember his theatrical wit, but solely the absolute ruin of a royal army deep in the American forest. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold survived his severe injuries from the fierce fighting at Bemis Heights, yet he emerged from the hospital profoundly cynical and damaged. His mangled leg refused to mend correctly, leaving him with an agonizing limp that would plague his every step for the remainder of his days. Consumed by resentment, he was forced to watch Horatio Gates, the man who had comfortably remained in the rear, reap all the glory. That gnawing sense of unfairness, coupled with mounting debts and a belief that Congress ignored his sacrifices, began to consume him completely. Over time, his deep-seated bitterness festered and twisted into something far more sinister than mere anger. By 1780, merely 3 years following his spectacular battlefield success, he orchestrated a treasonous deal to surrender West Point. His asking price for handing this crucial stronghold over to the British forces was a staggering £20,000. However, his secret scheme was unmasked before it could succeed, forcing the desperate commander to flee toward enemy lines. For the remainder of the conflict, he took up arms against the very nation he had previously bled to defend. The fearless warrior who had bravely stormed the Bremen Redoubt was now cemented as America's most notorious turncoat. Today, a solitary monument stands at the Saratoga battlefield to honor his undeniable tactical bravery and physical sacrifice. It takes the shape of a simple combat boot, paying silent tribute to the leg he shattered for the revolutionary cause. Yet, as a grim testament to his ultimate betrayal, the memorial famously carries no name carved into its stone. As for Burgoyne, he had once confidently boasted that he would sail back from the colonies draped in absolute victory. Instead, he arrived home in utter humiliation, while the mighty empire he fought for permanently lost its most valuable overseas territories. That fragile young republic he had attempted to crush in its cradle ultimately survived, eventually outlasting the British Empire itself. If you were captivated by this historical deep dive, please hit the subscribe button and leave a like to help our channel grow. We would also love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below which specific blunder truly doomed Burgoyne's campaign.